The night terror arrives. May 31st, 1915. London sleeps beneath a blanket of stars, unaware that something monstrous is coming. Then, just after 11, the sound begins. Not the rumble of distant thunder or the clatter of trains, but something entirely alien, a deep, throbbing drone that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. People stumble from their beds and rush into the streets, their faces turned skyward. And there, blotting out the constellations like some creature from a nightmare, hovers an airship so enormous it defies belief. 650 feet long, drifting through the darkness like a silver whale through an ocean of stars. The biggest flying machine ever constructed, and it belongs to the enemy. Trap doors open in the belly of the beast. Incendiary bombs tumble through the darkness, followed by grenades. The explosions tear through the night. Buildings shudder. Windows shatter. Panic spreads like wildfire through neighborhoods that had believed themselves safe from the horrors playing out across the Channel in France. For the first time in history, London is under attack from the air, and no one knows how to fight back. The German Zeppelin raids had begun, when the unthinkable becomes reality. Before that terrible May night, the very idea seemed impossible. War was something that happened elsewhere on distant battlefields in foreign lands. British civilians had been largely untouched by conflict for generations. The English Channel had always been their moat, their protection. But Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin's rigid airships changed everything. These weren't mere balloons. They were engineering marvels, massive aluminum frameworks containing 17 separate gas cells, each filled with highly flammable hydrogen. Powered by multiple engines and equipped with control surfaces, these dirigibles could travel at 85 miles per hour while carrying 2 tons of explosives. They could fly higher than any defensive weapon could reach, and in the darkness, they were nearly impossible to find. The German military had already tested these monsters against cities in Belgium and France. Now, with Kaiser Wilhelm's reluctant approval, they turned their attention to Britain. The first raid struck the coastal towns of Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn on January 19, 1915. A humble shoemaker named Samuel Smith became the first British civilian killed by German aerial bombardment. He would not be the last, not by a long shot. Throughout 1915 and into 1916, the attacks continued with terrifying regularity. The airship crews learned to time their raids with the dark period of the lunar cycle when the moon offered no illumination to British defenders. They would cross the North Sea from their bases on the German coast using the silver ribbon of the Thames as their guide to London's heart. The psychological impact was devastating. People called them baby killers after raids struck residential neighborhoods. Special nighttime attire for air raids became fashionable as citizens grew accustomed to fleeing their homes in panic. Factory hooters and railway whistles would sound warnings, and thousands would huddle in cellars and basements, listening to the drone of engines overhead and the crash of bombs around them. The terror was palpable, and the British government seemed powerless to stop it. The impossible challenge. Fighting back proved agonizingly difficult. The Zeppelins only attacked at night, which meant British pilots were flying completely blind unless a searchlight happened to catch the intruder. And even when they found one bringing it down, was another matter entirely. The early defenders faced a maddening problem. Their aircraft, mostly Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2C biplanes, could barely reach the altitude where Zeppelins cruised. These fabric-covered wood-framed machines were powered by engines producing a mere 70 horsepower. Climbing to 10,000 feet could take nearly an hour. By then, the Zeppelin had often vanished into the darkness or cloud cover, and if a pilot somehow managed to intercept an airship, standard bullets just punched small holes in the gas cells. The hydrogen would leak out slowly, but the damage was rarely enough to bring down these enormous craft. Pilots tried everything. They carried bombs and attempted to drop them from above. They fitted their aircraft with explosive darts. They even developed absurd contraptions like grappling hooks on cables meant to be dragged across a Zeppelin's hull and detonated on contact. Nothing worked. The Zeppelins kept coming and Britain's defenses seemed laughable. By mid-1916, London had been hit repeatedly. Hundreds were dead, thousands injured. Public outrage grew fierce. Newspapers demanded answers. Parliament erupted in fury. British pilots were risking their lives every night in antiquated aircraft, climbing through the frigid darkness, with nothing but canvas maps and compasses, hunting an enemy that seemed invincible. The War Office even believed incorrectly that the Zeppelins used a layer of inert gas to protect themselves from incendiary bullets. This misconception led them to discourage the use of such ammunition and focus instead on those useless bombs. The real problem was simpler but harder to solve. You needed to tear open the gas cells and ignite the hydrogen in the presence of oxygen. Small bullet holes wouldn't cut it. The inventors stepped forward. While British pilots struggled in the skies, brilliant minds worked frantically on solutions. 3 men would change everything. John Pomeroy was a New Zealand inventor who had been tinkering with explosive bullets since 1902. At age 12, he'd sold a patent for a non-slip clothes prop for 50 pounds. Over the years, he'd invented everything from painless rabbit traps to pneumatic horse collars. But his explosive bullet design would become his greatest contribution to history. The Pomeroy bullet was ingenious in its simplicity, a standard cartridge with a hollow copper tube in the bullet filled with dynamite. When it struck the minimal resistance of a Zeppelin's fabric envelope, it would explode, creating a larger hole and potentially igniting the hydrogen. His wife reportedly filled the first 5,000 bullets by hand at their kitchen table. Commander Frederick Brock of the Royal Navy came from the famous Brock fireworks family, and his expertise with pyrotechnics proved invaluable. The Brock bullet was designed to explode between the outer covering and gas cells of an airship using potassium chlorate to create both explosive force and sparks. James Buckingham developed a true incendiary round filled with yellow phosphorus. The Buckingham bullet had small holes near its base sealed with fusible metal that would melt from the friction of passing through air. Once the seal broke, the phosphorus would ignite on contact with oxygen, creating a brilliant smoke trace and intense heat. By the summer of 1916, these 3 ammunition types were ready. The strategy was devastatingly simple load, the Lewis gun magazines with alternating rounds. Pomeroy to tear open the fabric, Buckingham to ignite the hydrogen Brock to create explosive force and spreading fire. Together they formed a lethal cocktail specifically designed to kill Zeppelins. The British also developed an integrated defense system. Anti-aircraft guns multiplied across the country. By mid-1916, there were over 270 positioned around England. Searchlights probed the night sky. Most crucially, home defense squadrons were expanded and reorganized. The 39th Home Defence Squadron, based at Sutton's Farm near Hornchurch in Essex, became Britain's front line against the aerial menace. The night everything changed. September 2nd, 1916. The Germans launched their most ambitious raid of the war, 16 airships, including new Super Zeppelins, from both the Navy and Army converging on London. Among them was SL-11, a Schutte Lanz airship on its very first operational mission. The crew was confident. They'd been unstoppable for so long. Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson was 21 years old. Born in India to a coffee planter family educated in England, he'd joined the Royal Flying Corps and been posted to home defense duty. On that September night, he climbed into his BE-2C, a single-seater version, with an auxiliary fuel tank where the observer usually sat, and took off at 11 minutes past 11. The night was partially overcast, which made searching for the enemy even more difficult. Robinson climbed for nearly an hour, reaching 10,000 feet. He could see searchlights stabbing at the clouds, hear the distant thunder of anti-aircraft guns. At one point, he spotted a Zeppelin and gave chase, but the enormous craft, having dropped its bombs and shed weight, easily climbed away from him. Frustrated, Robinson exceeded his patrol time and headed toward London, hoping the city's searchlights might illuminate another target. Then, just after 2 in the morning, searchlights caught something. The beams converged on SL-11 as it circled for an attack run from the north. Robinson pushed his aircraft higher, climbing to 11,500 feet. The cold at that altitude was brutal. There was no enclosed cockpit, just an open frame buffeted by wind. Robinson wore thick leather and sheepskin, but the cold still bit deep. He came in from below, positioning himself 500 feet. Beneath and just behind, the airship. This was the recommended attack position, firing upward at a 45-degree angle into the belly of the beast. Robinson opened fire with his Lewis gun, raking the length of the enormous craft with his first drum of ammunition. Nothing happened. He reloaded, made another pass. Still nothing. The hydrogen wouldn't ignite. Robinson was down to his last drum. His fuel was running low. This was his final chance. Instead of spreading his fire along the entire length of the airship, he concentrated everything on a single spot in the rear quarter of the fuselage. The mixed ammunition Pomeroy Brock Buckingham poured into one concentrated point. Explosive rounds tearing open the fabric. Incendiary rounds igniting the escaping gas. And then it happened. Fire in the sky. The rear of SL-11 glowed red, then burst into brilliant orange flame. Within seconds, the entire airship was engulfed. What happened next was visible for 100 miles in every direction. The massive fireball hung suspended in the night sky like a second sun, then began its terrible descent. Londoners poured into the streets by the thousands, watching in awe and disbelief as the burning wreckage fell toward earth. Railway whistles blew. Factory hooters sounded not in warning this time, but in celebration. People sang patriotic songs, cheered, embraced strangers. The flaming wreck crashed in a field near the village of Cuffley in Hertfordshire. All 16 crew members perished in the inferno. It was a horrific death, trapped in a burning cage falling from the sky. But to the people of London who had lived in terror for nearly 2 years, it was vindication. Finally, someone had struck back. Finally, a British pilot had proven these monsters could be killed. Robinson landed at 2:45 in the morning, exhausted and nearly out of fuel. He discovered that Zeppelin gunners had shot away his machine gun's wire guard and pierced his wing's main spar several times. He'd been closer to death than he realized. Within hours, he learned he'd become a national celebrity. The hero and the turning point. Within 48 hours, the fastest ever awarded William Leaf Robinson received the Victoria Cross. His citation was remarkably brief for such a momentous action, simply stating he had attacked an enemy airship under circumstances of great difficulty and danger and sent it crashing to the ground as a flaming wreck. But the British public understood the significance. Robinson was mobbed in the streets. He received standing ovations in theaters, letters from schoolgirls, photographs from actresses, and over £3,500 in prize money put up by businessmen. The shy young pilot was embarrassed by the attention and requested a posting to France to escape the celebrity. His wish was granted in early 1917. On his first patrol over enemy lines on April 5th, his formation was engaged by German fighters led by Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself. Robinson was shot down and taken prisoner. His captors knew exactly who he was. As the famous Zeppelin destroyer, he was treated harshly, spending months in solitary confinement and being moved between camps. When he was finally repatriated in December 1918, his health was shattered. On December 31st, just days after his release, he died of Spanish flu at age 23. He never got to enjoy the peace his actions had helped secure. But Robinson's victory that September night changed everything. The tactic he'd proven worked. On September 23rd, Lieutenant Frederick Sauray of 39 Squadron used the same method to shoot down Zeppelin L-32 over Essex. On October 1st-2nd, Lieutenant Wulstan Tempest brought down the formidable L-31 over London in another spectacular fireball witnessed by thousands. Between September and December 1916, 6 German airships were destroyed by British night fighters using concentrated fire with mixed incendiary ammunition. The psychological impact on the German crews was catastrophic. These men had flown with confidence for nearly 2 years, believing themselves untouchable. Now they knew that every mission might be their last, that a lone British pilot in the darkness could turn their airship into a blazing coffin. The German Army's airship service withdrew from raids on Britain entirely. The Navy continued for a while, but commanders ordered their crews to fly at higher altitudes to avoid interception, often above 16,000 feet, where the extreme cold and lack of oxygen impaired the crews and made accurate bombing nearly impossible. The legacy. The Zeppelin raids didn't end completely. The Navy continued sporadic attacks into 1917, but the threat had been broken. The German High Command eventually concluded that successful airship attacks on London were no longer possible. They shifted to heavier-than-air bombers instead, Gothas and Giants, which would bring new terrors. But those are stories for another time. What happened over Britain in late 1916 was revolutionary. The Royal Flying Corps had pioneered night fighter tactics that would be refined and used in every subsequent conflict. The lessons learned the importance of searchlights and ground control, the need for specialized ammunition. The tactics of attacking from below all became fundamental principles of night fighting. By the time the First World War ended, 52 Zeppelin raids had struck England, killing 556 people and injuring over 1,300. The Germans lost 77 of their 115 military airships to combat and accidents. 379 highly trained officers and men died. For the vast destruction wrought on the Western Front, these numbers seem small. But the Zeppelin raids represented something new and terrible, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations from the air. It was a glimpse of the horrors that would become commonplace in the Second World War. The BE-2C aircraft that accomplished these victories was ironically a terrible fighter plane. Its extreme stability, designed for reconnaissance and artillery spotting, made it hopelessly vulnerable to enemy fighters over France. British pilots called it Fokker fodder, and worse. Albert Ball, one of Britain's greatest aces, described it as a bloody, awful aeroplane. But in the specific role of night fighting against Zeppelins, that same stability proved invaluable. It provided a steady gun platform in the darkness, allowing pilots to hold their aim steady as they poured fire into the hydrogen-filled monsters above. The men who flew these missions were pioneers in every sense. They climbed into open cockpits with minimal navigation equipment, just a canvas map and a compass. They flew through freezing darkness, buffeted by wind, searching for an enemy that could be anywhere in the vast night sky. When they found their target, they had to climb to altitudes where oxygen deprivation affected their thinking and frostbite threatened their extremities. Then, they had to position themselves beneath a hydrogen bomb, carrying tons of explosives, firing upward, while enemy gunners shot back. It required courage beyond measure. The inventors Pomeroy, Brock, and Buckingham had created weapons specifically designed to exploit the Achilles heel of these mighty airships. Their bullets turned the Zeppelin's greatest advantage into their fatal weakness. Hydrogen made them light and gave them their incredible lifting power, but it also made them floating bombs, waiting for the right spark. The mixed ammunition provided that spark with devastating efficiency. Looking back from our modern age of stealth fighters and precision-guided munitions, those early night fighter pilots seem almost impossibly brave. They had none of the technology we take for granted. No radar, no radio communication, no ejection seats or parachutes, no enclosed cockpits or oxygen systems. Just wooden frames covered in fabric temperamental engines and their own skill and determination. When William Leaf Robinson concentrated his fire on that one spot on SL-11, when he held his position despite the return fire and the freezing cold and the danger of collision with burning debris, he wasn't just shooting down an airship. He was proving that human ingenuity and courage could overcome even the most terrifying weapons. He was demonstrating that civilians didn't have to live in helpless fear. He was showing that the night sky could be defended. The birth of the night fighter over Britain in 1916 marked a turning point not just in that war, but in the nature of warfare itself. It established principles and tactics that would evolve through the Battle of Britain in 1940, through the night bomber streams over Germany, through radar-guided interceptions in Korea and Vietnam, right up to the present day. Every modern night fighter, every aircraft equipped to find and destroy enemies in darkness owes something to those pioneering pilots in their fabric-covered biplanes, hunting Zeppelins over London. The terror from above had been answered. The silver monsters that had seemed invincible had been brought down in flames. And Britain had learned a hard lesson that would serve it well in the even darker days to come, that when faced with a new weapon designed to spread fear, the answer isn't to cower in darkness. The answer is to learn, adapt, and fight back with everything you have. That's what William Leaf Robinson did on that September night in 1916. That's what dozens of other night fighter pilots did in the months that followed. They took the fight to the enemy. They mastered combat in conditions that seemed impossible. They turned the hunters into the hunted. And in doing so, they wrote the first chapter in the long history of night fighter warfare, a chapter written in fire against the darkness over London.